I got my camera to work. Thank you to IT who figured that out. I'm sorry that you had a personless lecture last week, but hopefully the concepts made sense to you. And if those made sense to you last week, then today should really not be that difficult, or this week should not be that difficult. What I've done is I've posted all the worksheets that we're going to work on. It's one worksheet and one table this week on Blackboard along with this lecture. So feel free to pull those up. But today we're talking about monopoly. Monopoly is the second easiest market structure to work with. It's more complicated than perfect competition because in perfect competition, remember, the firm is a price taker. They have no say over what the price is, so they only decide on the quantity. A monopolist does have say over the price, and so it has to choose which price to charge as well. With that being said, a monopolist is constrained by the demand curve. So I always joke around and I say, well, I am a monopolist of my own artwork, which actually, I'm in my office, so I can show you. I do actually work on artwork. I did a watercolor book. Not very talented person, right? So I'm a monopolist, but unfortunately no one wants my artwork, right? But a monopoly is a market structure in which a single firm serves an entire market for a good that has no close substitutes. So I actually just taught this in my other class today. The best example in our lives is probably the local utilities company, which is regulated so that there's barriers to entry. So here it's NIPSCO, Northwest Indiana Public something. Our power went out last night, so I'm a little upset with NIPSCO. Like trash collection, right? Usually there's a monopoly on that. Another example is a prescription drug with a patent. So I take a drug called Emgality for my migraines, and it is, I think, $700 a month if my insurance doesn't cover it. There's a patent, right? There's no close substitutes, so they can get away with doing that. There's also a monopoly on frisbees. Maybe I mentioned that last class. Whammo is a monopoly. Some people say that diamonds are a monopoly. Mine happens to be a non-De Beers diamond, but De Beers is kind of a monopolist. But being the sole seller of a good in the market gives that firm greater market power than if it competed against other firms. So we're not going to draw a separate market and firm demand curve because it's the same thing. The market is the firm. However, a monopolist does not have unlimited market power because, again, they're constrained by the demand for the product. All right, so here's the monopolist demand curve. You'll note that it's not a horizontal line, right? So we've got a downward sloping demand curve. Seems obvious, but the fact that we have a downward sloping demand curve means that marginal revenue is no longer equal to demand. So with perfect competition, demand was equal to marginal revenue. So we could use the optimization rule, price equals marginal cost. Here we cannot do that. Marginal revenue is going to be different. So what does this mean? This means that if you're selling P0 and Q0 products, you can charge this price, right? Q0 products, you charge P0. If you want to sell more, you can't just lower the price for the new consumer. You actually have to lower the price for everyone. So additional revenue of producing one more actually is less than the price. Hopefully you'll see what I mean when we go through the little graph in a second. So what are sources of monopoly power? One of them is economies of scale. This is when long-run average costs decline as output increases. I do have an economies of scale question in your homework, even though it seems kind of out of place in the monopoly chapter. But it's a source of monopoly, so we remember what that means. This would be a natural monopoly. So if it's just the costs are, economies of scale are so intense that it makes sense for a firm to just be huge, then that makes the conditions for monopoly. Economies of scope and cost complementarity. This is not something I taught you before. Economies of scope is when the total cost of producing two products within the same firm is lower than when they're produced by two separate firms. Cost complementarity is when the marginal cost of producing one output is reduced when the output of another product is increased. Don't even really need you to know these. It's just things that if you were to go deep into the study of monopoly, you would need to be aware of. And then the one that we're the most familiar with is patents and other legal barriers. I think a lot of times, like in a developing country, there tends to be more legal barriers. Like there's one producer of gasoline or something like that. But patents to me is the most obvious example of a monopoly power. So my husband has asthma, and he never has a generic asthma option because there's always so many technological advances that there's new products with patents. So he just always has to pay a high amount for his asthma meds. All right, so marginal revenue, the additional revenue from producing one more. I mentioned this before, it's less than price. Why is it less than price? If I'm selling goods at $20 and I want to get more people to buy it, let's say I drop the price to 10, I have to drop the price to 10 for everyone, right? I can't just drop it for the new people. So my additional revenue is less than the price. Now let's take a look. If you pull up Chapter 8, Table 3, we have got the demand curve here. Make it a little bigger. Okay. So the first thing I would always ask is, does this follow the law of demand? Is this reasonable? Yes. As quantity increases, price decreases, inverse relationship. Now let's take a look at total revenue. Total revenue is price times quantity. So if you sell 0, of course your total revenue is 0. And we can see here that total revenue increases and then decreases. Why is this? Because with a linear demand curve, the elasticity changes as you move along the curve. So up here, it is more elastic because as the price drops, total revenue increases. We're probably at unit elasticity at 9 because it hits the peak and then it decreases. Next thing to note, let's discuss marginal revenue. Marginal revenue, the additional revenue of producing one more. All right, there we go. So marginal revenue, if I highlight this, is not the same as price. So when we discussed a perfectly competitive market, price and marginal revenue were the same thing. You can see once we get past the first product, the price of, if you sell one more, the price is $160, your additional revenue is only $150. Okay, and that's because you've had to drop the price for the first person. So let's go back to the slide here and you can see this graphically. So we've got our demand curve here, and marginal revenue is less than demand. Now one thing that's worth noting is for a linear demand curve, marginal revenue is always going to be twice the slope. You can actually show this with calculus. If you get the total revenue curve, you would just take the demand curve and multiply it by quantity one more time. You get a squared term. Then when you take the derivative, the slope is 2. Okay, so you can show that it's always going to be double the slope. If what I said doesn't make sense, doesn't matter. It's fine. Let's remember though, back in Chapter 3, we discussed elasticity. There's an elastic portion of the demand curve. As quantity increases because price is decreasing, total revenue increases. Hits the point at unit elasticity, and then at that point, if you reduce the price, your total revenue falls. We are going to see that a monopolist always produces in the elastic portion. So if the goal is to maximize total revenue, the monopolist should always provide at produce at unit elasticity. That's not the case. The case is not to maximize revenue. The case is to maximize profit. So when we bring in marginal cost curve, you're going to see it actually ends up being over here. All right, so this is something I debated showing you. I'm not testing you on this, but if you have a linear inverse demand function, which looks like this, the marginal revenue is going to look like this. And again, you can derive this with calculus, but you can see here, yeah, you know what, I don't even want to talk about it. Forget that I even showed you that. All right, moving on. How does a monopolist decide how much to produce? There's two questions here. They have to decide how much to produce and also what price to charge. So let's cover the first one. How do they choose how much to produce? The same way every firm does ever. They produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, or as close as they can get without marginal cost being greater than marginal revenue. The difference between a monopolist and a perfectly competitive firm is the price they charge. The price they charge, given the level of output, so they choose the output first, what they do is they choose the price on the demand curve that corresponds to that quantity. So they think, okay, I want to produce 5. What price should I charge? They look at the demand curve and think, what price can I get away with charging, right? They want to charge the highest price they can. So that may have not made sense. Hopefully this helps. So we've got our demand curve. We've got our total revenue over here. What I've done here is I've added in our cost curves. We've got average total cost, and marginal cost. I did not include average variable cost or fixed cost here because we don't need it to do what we're doing. I could have included it. We could probably figure that out. The fixed cost is clearly 100, but we just don't need it. So the first way to determine the profit maximizing quantity is to calculate profit. Total revenue minus total cost. We can take a look here. That is clearly not right. Yep. Total revenue is this. There we go. All right. So the profit maximizing quantity appears to me to be 6. Now the other thing we can do is we can look at marginal revenue and marginal cost. Let's make them both green. So we compare marginal revenue and marginal cost. You might want to actually pause here and try and figure this out on your own. Okay, so you produce any where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. Get as close as you can. With marginal cost should never be greater than marginal revenue. Yes, 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 no. So you do not want to produce the 7th because marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue. The 6th right here, there we go. So we can see there's 2 ways to calculate the profit maximizing quantity. One is calculate the total profit. This is tedious, right? If you're producing millions of products or thousands of products, it's going to be probably not all that useful to do. The easier thing is look at additional revenue and additional cost and use our profit maximizing rule. Now the question is, what price are they going to charge? So you look at this, they're producing 6. What price do they charge? Let's look at the demand curve. So if the demand curve is over here in yellow, that tells us at the quantity of 6, we can charge the price of 120. So that's what they do. They charge a price of 120. So this corresponds to this worksheet here, which basically I just talked you through, but let's think about this bonus question. This is something that I like to do in class. I don't know about you guys, but I always have the students that are advanced, and I really, really want to teach them more, right? But if I try to teach them the advanced concepts, I lose everyone else. These bonus questions are a way of doing this. If you have time, it will challenge you, but if you don't, it's fine. So if this was a perfectly competitive industry, producers would produce until price equals marginal cost. How do the price and quantity in the monopoly market compare with the production in the perfectly competitive market? And which is better for consumers? So we would use the rule price equals marginal cost. So I'd be comparing column B with column G. And it seems to me that 7 would be the amount that would be produced in a perfectly competitive market. So which one is better for consumers? The perfectly competitive outcome. First of all, more is sold. If you're someone willing to pay 110, now you get to buy it, and the price is lower. All right, so I'm going to pause right now. We'll pick it up right after this.